Voilà. Merci. Bonjour. Mes amis. Bonjour à tout le monde et bienvenue à l'Alliance française de Chicago. I'm Mary Ellen, the executive director of the Alliance, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you today to our 21st Symposium on the Arts of France. And our theme this year is La sculpture, l'art de la séduction, sculpture, the art of seduction. So we ask you to join our three eminent speakers this spring as they showcase lascivious statues, furnish moral tales of 18th century France, and the battle for independence of Camille Claudel. So if you have not already, do register for the next talk in our symposium with David Pullins, who is traveling from the Metropolitan Museum of Art for his talk, The Sofa, Staging Bodies in the 18th Century Paris on May 17th. And then we will close the series on June the 7th, when we welcome Emerson Boyer of our own Art Institute, who will speak on Camille Claudel, art, love, and the battle for independence. And now, on behalf of our board of directors and our women's board, I want to express huge thanks to Gloria Groom, and yes, absolutely, and her steering committee for their direction and thoughtful guidance, honestly, without which this exceptional series would not take place. I'd also like to thank our grand patrons and our patrons also for their loyal support and immense generosity who make this possible. I think we should give them a round of applause as well. And finally, I ask all of you to join me in thanking our fearless and very elegant leader of the symposium for the past 10 years, Madame Miriam Bransfield. Merci beaucoup. Oh, and yes, and her left and right, Honoré Hoffman. Yes, of course. He's not in the room. He's not in the room because he's busy doing other things today. And then to all of you who are here at the Alliance or online, we thank you, un très grand merci, and delighted that you're all joining us in our quest to learn more about the patrimoine of France, French heritage. So now allow me to introduce our returning friend. She was a new friend last year, and we're so glad that she's joining us again, Alicia Caticha. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Art History at Northwestern and holds a Ph.D. from the University of Virginia. Alicia specializes in 18th and 19th century European sculpture and decorative arts, with a particular focus on issues of materiality, colonialism, and popular culture. Her current research concerns the 18th century French sculptor Étienne-Maurice Falconet and the replications and reverberations of his work in porcelain and sugar sculptures. She has published on the history of fashion from the 18th century to the present day in Journal 18, 18th Century Fiction, and American Quarterly. Alicia's research has been supported by the Center for the Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, the Decorative Arts Trust, and the Newberry Library. She is a busy lady, I can tell you. So without further ado, à vous, Alicia.
Merci, Mary-Ellen, for that wonderful, very kind introduction. It is such an honor to be back. Last year, being introduced to the Alliance was a yearly highlight for my academic life. So it was so wonderful to be re-invited to talk about my upcoming book project, of which this is a portion. I also want to thank Corneille for organizing everything and for continually forcing me to answer my emails when I do not respond to him. I want to make a few notes before I begin. There's going to be a fair amount of textual evidence, so I've tried best to incorporate those quotes into the slide for better oral comprehension. And some of the images, the image quality is not quite there yet. There are often, a lot of these works are in private collections, so I'm still working on getting really good photography. So with that said, let us begin. It is no exaggeration that in 18th century France, that in 18th century, France was collectively obsessed with the Greek myth of Pygmalion and Galatea. First recounted in Ovid's Metamorphosis, the myth tells the tale of the sculptor Pygmalion, who fell so deeply in love with his statue of his own making that she was transformed from a sculptor into a living, breathing woman. The myth became the subject of numerous paintings and even plays, most famously Rousseau's Pygmalion, seen here in both imagined and amateur performances. In fact, it was in the 18th century that Pygmalion's sculptor was at last given a name, Galatea. Even more significantly, she was transformed from Ovid's original ivory statue to the marble sculpture that we associate with her today. Of all the 18th century artists taking on this myth, only one artist became known as the author of Pygmalion, the sculptor Étienne-Maurice Falconet. Falconet earned the moniker with the immediate success of his marble group Pygmalion and Galatea, which debuted at the Salon of 1763. In my talk today, I'm going to discuss the sculptor's monumental influence on the art and culture of 18th century France. Not only did this sculpture group influence a host of painters and sculptors invested in taking up the literal and metaphorical representations of the Pygmalion myth, it also became emblematic of theoretical considerations of sculpture and animation more broadly. What did it mean to animate Galatea, to transform marble into flesh? And what was the erotic potential and danger implicit in such transformations? In answering these questions, I shall split my talk today into two parts. First, we will look at the oeuvre of Falconet and the philosophical and material concerns taking up in his engagement with both the material of marble and the enduring myth of Ovid's enduring myth. And in the second half of my talk, I shall then turn to Falconet's wider influence, introducing a host of small-scale decorative statuettes that proliferated throughout elite and aristocratic domestic interiors, and thusly enacting their own animation akin to Galatea. Falconet first achieved widespread acclaim 5 years before the debut of Pygmalion and Galatea with his Bather in 1757. Standing at approximately 2.5 feet, this marble nude dips her foot into the imagined water beyond the threshold of the pedestal. With her eyes cast downward, the viewer senses her trepidation in a moment of potential energy. Where she bends at the waist, her muscles seem to clench. The same can be said for her legs, which unequally bear the weight of her shifting movement. Her knees allude to the muscles and tendons underneath the surface of the skin. The folds of the drapery articulate the structure of a chemise with a hemmed sleeve through which one could imagine she had just a moment before slid out of her arm upon undressing. Likely based off the composition of Lemoine's 1724 Bather, Falconet differentiates his statuette from the colorful composition by bringing the viewer's attention to the vast expanses of marble, the plane of her stomach, the curve of her hip, the length of her thighs. The perfectly sculpted flesh melts away to reveal the immaculate treatment of the material. Upon seeing Falconet's bather at the Salon, an anonymous critic in the Mercure de France imagined her completing her step. The figure, he writes, seems to already feel upon entering the bath a light shiver from the cold water. Another critic wrote that Falconet's vision of nature seduces. The understanding of anatomy and material that allowed Falconet to evoke the sensory effects of flesh touching the chilly water is brought to bear through the sculptor's primary focus, the sensuality of surface. The 18th century proto-archaeologist, the Comte de Caylus, spoke to this when he wrote that the imitation of skin is the sole object and principle of sculpture. The Bather was debuted at the Salon alongside Falconet's equally successful Menacing Cupid. Together, the two marbles create a dynamic pair. On one hand, we have an ideal feminine bather in a small and intimate format, her body vibrating with sensation. The other, a mischievous Cupid, seated on a voluptuously textured cloud and holding one finger to his lips to silence the viewer as he begins to draw an arrow from its quiver. Falconet's cheeky Cupid exposes the erotic nature of sculptural viewing. Placed next to the bather, we can imagine the target of Cupid's arrow is an innocent bystander viewing the luscious woman and about to fall in love. It is no accident that Menacing Cupid is reproduced in what is arguably the most famous of all 18th century Rococo paintings, Fragonard's The Swing. Just barely in the frame, this Cupid, although a statue, becomes an active participant in the scene, witnessing the secret liaison. His silencing gesture now warns the secret lovers or promises to hide their secret. He will not tell it. Although Falconet's Bather and Menacing Cupid were each commissioned by different patrons and were therefore not intended to be pendants, 6 years later, Falconet did just that and referenced both works in his celebrated Pygmalion and Galatea. Here we are witness, on the left, we are witness to the very first moments of Galatea's animation. A kneeling Pygmalion has only just cast aside his chisel, and we see it at his knee right here. His hands are clasped tightly together in a gesture of disbelief. Galatea, with eyes still closed, cannot meet the insistent gaze of her maker. Yet we see the very first hints of her animation as she begins to just barely flex her fingers and tighten the muscle of her left leg. As she begins to bend at the knee, we as the viewer can project the resulting act, the step off the circular plinth. Just as Falconet's Bather stepped off the pedestal and into the water, the plinth becomes a symbol of sculpture and the step a symbol of its animation. Falconet, though, did not just cite himself once, but twice. A small Cupid grasps onto Galatea's hand, kissing it and imbuing her static form with life. The philosopher Denis Diderot, in his celebrated Salon review of the sculpture, called out Falconet for citing his Cupid, addressing the sculptor directly. "You mischievous boy," he wrote, "I recognize you." Falconet, by citing his own sculpture, was at once rendering the sculpture of Pygmalion and Galatea, while also taking on the role of Pygmalion himself, reframing the subject matter through a uniquely self-referential lens. Falconet's 18th century audience would have immediately understood the intended goal here, to communicate the transition from marble to flesh using the very material that the mythical Pygmalion used to carve Galatea. This is in deliberate contrast to painted representations of the myth, in which Galatea's animation is signaled to us through chromatic means. As Galatea is infused with life, as seen here on the right, her flesh is hued pink. This is in deliberate contrast to her legs, which remain cold and lifeless. As Angela Rosenthal has brilliantly illustrated, white skin was not viewed in the 18th century as a singular color. Rather, white skin allowed for the translucency that revealed the rich tonalities of the blood flowing beneath the surface. Both women and men simulated the effect by powdering one's skin, creating a pale mask, and rouging then one's cheeks on top of that. In François Boucher's celebrated portrait of Madame de Pompadour, the Marquise acts out the ritual of the blush. In short, the blush becomes an important signifier of female vitality and the very characteristics deployed in the representations of Galatea. In sculpture, however, one had to evoke this animation without, as Falconet himself described it, the seductive charm of color. And I don't think it's an accident here that he uses the word seductive. Later on, he put it more simply, though, color is not that of sculpture. The association between white marble and sculpture had become so assumed by the mid-18th century that it is largely absent in the majority of contemporaneous texts on the subject. Even the encyclopedia entry for marble sculpture makes no mention of marble's coloration. Only in Baron Daulac's entry on the geology of marble is color explicitly stated. For statues, he wrote, one chooses marble that is white and has no colored veins. Marble veins were a very real concern for working sculptors. Allegrin's 1767 beaver, for example, was brutally criticized as stained, tarnished, and impure due to the dramatic brown and gray veins running through the stone. The specification that these marble blocks should not have naturally occurring veins reinforced the link between the whiteness of marble and the artist's manipulation of surface texture to mimic the surface of skin. Falconet outlined this goal in his laudatory description of Pierre Puget's Milan of Crotone, and I quote, "In what Greek statue does one find a feeling for the folds of the skin, the softness of the flesh, and the fluidity of the blood?" Writing in 1769, Daudet de Jussin described his reaction to sculpture in similar terms. Sculpture, I must admit, will always surprise us by giving life, expression, and the softness of flesh in the hardest of materials. I have included the original French of both these quotations to highlight the frequent deployment of the term mollesse to describe the softness and malleability of flesh conveyed in marble. The Dictionary of the French Academy of 1762 specifically categorized mollesse as one relating to the arts, connoting a flexibility or softness of the body. However, the second definition, while still denoting softness, suggests a softness of character, more specifically the loss of vigor, courage, or confidence. In this pejorative context, mollesse denotes a type of feminization of the male character and sensibility. While the term was a positive descriptor with regards to the appearance of flesh in marble, it nevertheless carried these gendered implications. It is no surprise then that the most celebrated use of the term mollesse appears in Denis Diderot's famous passage describing Falconet's Pygmalion. In this Salon review, he applauds the statue for its ability to transform Galatea from marble to flesh. He imagines touching the nude figure and requests that his reader do the same. How soft the flesh, no, it cannot be marble. Put a finger on it. The hardness of the material is gone. It will give beneath your touch. And we're going to return back and back again to this quote because it is just so magisterial. Diderot's prose traces, like the marble group itself, the transformation from Galatea, from marble to life, and the transformation of the sculpture group from marble to life. all via the manipulation of surface of marble at the hand of the sculptor's chisel. And I quote Diderot again, "Oh, Falconet, how did you do it? In a single piece of white stone, surprise, joy, and love blended together. Rival the gods, they may have brought this statue to life, but you have renewed the miracle and done the same for its sculptor." This double metamorphosis is particularly evident when we view the marble group from behind, a large voluminous cloud, one not so different from the pedestal in his Cupid, dominates the composition. Falconet intentionally contrasts the texture of the cloud with the smooth contours of the figures. However, rather than resembling a cloud, a viscous, permeable mass of water vapor, Falconet instead treats the marble with a ribbed, textured quality that resembles unpolished and unsculpted stone. In short, Falconet is weaving us through the steps of sculptor's making and Galatea's animation. Beginning with the raw block of marble, we move to the sculpted figures and finally to their animation into sentient human flesh. It is the perfect coalescing between material and subject matter. Mollesse, the softness of skin in the hardest of materials, was the means through which sculptors could visualize the primary characteristics of Galatea's animation, the blush, without color. And no sculptor embraced this more than Falconet, whose penchant for small, delicate female nudes, beginning with his Bather and Galatea, would define his career. Here I have included a sampling of his statuettes in marble and porcelain that would become synonymous with his name. A quick note on the porcelain statuettes. Falconet was the director of Sèvres Porcelain Manufactory Sculpture Workshop from 1757 to 66. During his tenure, he replicated many of his popular marble works in porcelain, and he was one of the first marble sculptors to take advantage of the material similarities between marble and new developments in French soft-case porcelain. Although beyond the scope of my talk today, I want to mention these porcelain figures because they really do illustrate how Falconet translated mollesse across materials. And they were also known to highlight the very erotic connotations of mollesse that we'll be turning to soon. So Falconet's early biographer, Louis Rowe, remarked on the suspect number of small nude bathers attributed to Falconet, writing, quote, "It confounds the imagination and defies all statistics." And in many ways, that's the quote that got me interested in this project to begin with. Indeed, Falconet's Bather and Pygmalion and Galatea inspired a proliferation of small-scale statuettes in marble, featuring female nudes that only in the past 2 decades have been reattributed to sculptors including Tessert and the Broche brothers. It was precisely this conflation of marble and skin, of mollesse, that Tessert and Broche brothers sought to emulate. A la Falconet, their female nudes universally feature small oval heads with slight chins and delicately pointed noses. Their bodies are slender with small breasts high on their chest. While visual comparison suggests that these sculptors were indeed looking to Falconet, in the case of Tessert, we know that he purchased a small version of Menacing Cupid from the esteemed art collector Lallive de Julie in 1770. He also produced at least one, if not 2 copies of Falconet's Bather, which sold in 1774 and 79. Within this context, Tessert's Venus and its delicate and soft handling of marble speaks to the sculptor's vested aesthetic interest in emulating Falconet. Details such as the tendon in her leg and her lower fleshy back evoke mollesse, praised by Falconet's admirers. And in fact, it was this marble flesh nexus that dominated the reception of Tessert's Venus on the left. At the Salon of 1769, one critic applauded the figure for the feeling of flesh and the softness, while another noted Tassin's delicate handling of the material. As we turn to the dissemination and consumption of these statuettes, marble and animation and the Pygmalion myth again coalesce, engendering the fetishization and the eroticization of the feminine sculptural ideal. Part 2, lascivious statues. In 1776, Tassin's Venus went up for sale as part of the art collection of Monsieur de Gagny. The statuette was listed in the accompanying sale catalog thusly: height 9 pouces on a gilded wooden base and in a glass case. Although the description appears to be fairly innocuous and in keeping with sale catalogs of the period, the presence of the glass case is a curious outlier. The unfiltered tactile access to sculpture, especially small-scale works such as Tassin's nude, were one of the defining features of an 18th century French sculpture cabinet, begging the question, why would a private collector place a sculptor in his personal residence under a glass case? A curious painting by Jean-Baptiste Mallet features Tassin's Venus similarly displayed, and we see it right here in the corner. The painting explicitly stages the domestic interior, replete with a canopied bed and an elegantly upholstered wooden chair of an emphatically feminine space. The domestic scene, however, is jarringly disrupted by the figure of a nude woman sitting on another's lap, calmly drinking chocolate from a white tass. The only other nude figure in the scene is the marble statuette tucked away atop the wardrobe. Unlike the women in the painting, the statuette is not disruptive. Secured in a glass case, its erotic potential is contained. If this painting offers any indication as to why Monsieur Gagny placed his own marble Venus thusly, it is likely this: Tassin's Venus was a marble work known for its handling of flesh and marble. Behind a glass case, the temptation to touch the seemingly soft skin would have been forcibly curbed. While Mallet's After the Bath can only offer speculative insight into the day-to-day anxieties or proclivities that caused Gagny to place the Tassin's behind glass, the painting does demonstrate the very real erotic potential of these small-scale nude female statuettes. Just as we saw earlier in Fragonard's The Swing, these statuettes became active subjects in paintings depicting fashionable life, as seen here in Nicolas Levrance's Two Women Reading a Letter and Mallet's The Morning Toilette and The Hairdresser. In addition to illustrating the use and consumption of these statuettes within the domestic interiors of the 18th century French elite, these scenes attest to the hegemonic presence of the Falconet-inspired female nude throughout the popular visual culture of the period. By broaching the subject of the Falconet type statue in relationship to ostensibly living, sensual female bodies, these paintings illustrate how mollesse was essential to the aestheticization and fetishization of the female sculptural nude more broadly. Returning briefly back to Mallet's After the Bath, we can now recognize the deliberate quotation of Tassin's Venus. Such an inclusion not only added to the surfeit of bodies in the painting, but encouraged the viewer to compare the well-known sculptural form to the living, animate bodies of the women in the painting. In this sense, Mallet was evoking the Pygmalion myth. While many art historians have noted the frequent quotation of Falconet's menacing Cupid, little has been given to this quotation of the female statuettes. This is primarily due to menacing Cupid's prominent role in Fragonet's Swing, which I already have even showed today, but also it should be noted that the Swing was based on an earlier composition by Pierre-Antoine Baudouin, in which Falconet's marble acts as both instigator to the drama and a stand-in to the viewer, and we see that on the left. Baudouin was one of the most popular painters of libertine subjects in the 1750s and 60s, and he began the trend for quoting this specific genre of sculpture in libertine paintings. In two undated miniatures, Baudouin depicts two women bathing in rivers, each corresponding strikingly to the compositions of Tassert's Venus and the Frère Roche. In the first painting on the left, the figure's limbs are similarly positioned, including that unique elongated stretch of her right arm. On the second, on the right, the bather washes her foot, the mirror image of the Broche figure. While it remains unclear whether these paintings are actively animating the two sculptures or if the sculptors actually took their composition from paintings such as this, the existence of these miniatures points to emulative circuitries between this corpus of painting and sculpture. Of Baudouin's followers, Jean-Baptiste Mallet and Nicolas Lavoance would deploy the motif of the Falconet type most consistently, illustrating these sculptures throughout their painted oeuvre and playing with that relationship between marble and the sentient animated body. The question of sculptural animation recalls Diderot's Salon of 1763, describing Pygmalion and Galatea. As I have illustrated, Diderot's laudatory description of the animated soft flesh ontologically links the Pygmalion myth to the aesthetics of Molas. Diderot notably returns to this subject 2 decades later in his philosophical dialogue, D'Alembert's Dream, first published in 1782. In the text opening scene, the fictional Diderot offers up Falconet's masterpiece for edible consumption. I'm not making this up. He does so in response to the fictional D'Alembert's query regarding the differences between man and statue, between marble and flesh, differences that are theoretically integral to Galatea's animation. And it's really worth quoting in length because I just find this section so funny, and but please forgive my acting. D'Alembert, making marble edible doesn't strike me as a very easy thing to do. Diderot, I see that it's up to me to explain this method to you. I will take that statue you see there, put it in a mortar, and after a few good blows with my pestle, not so fast, please, this statue is one of Falconet's masterpieces. Of course, if it were by Horace or one of the others, Falconet wouldn't mind. The statue has been paid for, and Falconet gives little enough thought to his present-day reputation, let alone his future glory. D'Alembert, go ahead then, grind it up. The point that Diderot is trying to make is one in keeping with 18th century theories of materialism, which oppose the Cartesian dualism between the mind and the body in favor of just one substance, matter. The myth of Pygmalion and Galatea and the trope of living marble perfectly elided those boundaries between animate and inanimate. And this is precisely what Diderot aimed to demonstrate with the physical act of consuming Falconet's Pygmalion. He's saying we can eat it because it is the same material as us. These theories, however, quickly took on a hedonistic turn. Infamous proponents of libertinage, such as the Marquis de Sade, appropriated a materialist system in which pleasure was the organizing principle. Diderot's own commitment to materialism permeated his own two noteworthy literary forays into the genre, Le Bijou Indiscret and La Religieuse. Diderot's tactile response to Falconet's Galatea, we recall how soft the flesh, no, it cannot be marble, put a finger on it. Now read within this context, suddenly is deeply philosophical, but also very explicitly erotic. By the 1770s, actually, the animation of marble had become a common trope in erotic novels. In Vivant Denon's 1777, No Tomorrow, or Point de l'Endemont in French, the object of the young male protagonist's desire, Madame T, is described as feeling nothing, she is made of marble. Later, however, the protagonist, having now been seduced by Madame T, admires her post-coital complexion, and I quote, "The color of her lips, more vivid than usual, set off the enamel of her teeth and made her smile more voluptuous. Red blushes, scattered here and there, set off the whiteness of her complexion and attested to its delicacy." Note the blush. The young protagonist here is quite literally taking on the role of Pygmalion, and Madame T becomes his Galatea through the rouging of her marble-like skin. It is this same eroticization of mollesse, this nexus of skin, whiteness, marble, that underlies the erotic charge of these statuettes. These statues were part of an iconography of sexual illusion that transformed more ambiguous images of aristocratic life into those of a libertine variety. In Lascivious, the love letter here on the left, a woman discreetly passes a letter to the man playing the harp behind her, unbeknownst to her female companion. Atop a pedestal in the corner of the room sits Tasseur's Venus. The statue observes the scene from the high vantage point, witnessing the letter exchange and perhaps making explicit its licentious content. The female protagonist is clearly conducting an affair of seduction with someone decidedly below her station. In Lascivious' Scène Galante, which is seen on the upper right, Tasseur's Venus, now viewed from behind, has been transformed into a larger-than-life garden statue. Before her, an amorous couple sits on the bench. The female counterpart looks up towards the nude sculptural form, foreshadowing the outcome of the scene. In both, Tasseur's Venus positions the viewer to understand the settings, be it the garden or the drawing room, as locations for intimate or forbidden erotic encounters. In the visit, we have the presence of Broche's bather on the mantle, offering an alternate object of delectation for the viewer's eyes, providing a nude figure in a scene where there is none. The mirror behind the small statuette reflects the figure's composition, creating a doubling effect that pulls the viewer's gaze to the figure before her, guiding one's attention to the standing woman who looks down at her companion. The seated figure's languid pose, leaning against that fire screen, cues the viewer to the possible illicit intentions, and again returns our view to the statuette. In this multilateral web of glances between statue and women, we see the erotic intrigue without crossing the line into overt exhibitionism. Again, an understanding of libertine novels sheds light on the function these statuettes played in heightening erotic tension. The cabinet and descriptions of decor were critical aspects of the genre, setting the stage for the erotic encounter. Enclosed private spaces, such as this small boudoir, originally from the Hôtel des Crayons, were furnished with paintings, sculptures, porcelain, etc. These art objects could function in multiple ways, engendering intimacy, encouraging imitation, or providing fantastical settings in which one could inhabit personas. And I believe you're going to go deep into this with David Pullen's coming talk on the sofa. Returning to Denon's No Tomorrow, it is notable that the climax of the novel is not the coupling of the protagonist and the infamous Madame T. In fact, the narrator is quick to confess that, quote, "It was no longer Madame T that I desired, it was her cabinet." It is only upon viewing her private salon that the protagonist is seduced. This salon, which he describes in detail, includes the presence of mirrors and small-scale statuettes. Here we have one of the few mirrored cabinets to survive to the present day, and which is open to the public at the Hôtel de la Marine in Paris. This room was built by a confirmed bachelor and libertine, no surprise, Pierre-Élisabeth de Fontainebleau, and it originally included painted figures in lascivious positions on the mirrors. However, the wife of the next owner of the home had the decor completely altered to what we see today, which are frolicking cherubs and elegantly dressed women. So she censored it a lot. Nevertheless, it is precisely this style of room that our protagonist finds himself in. And I quote, "I found myself in a vast cage of mirrors. On one side was a statue handing out crowns of flowers. A temple of light-hearted design completed the decor on the other side. I fell at her feet. She leaned towards me because the couple we formed was repeated at every angle. I saw an island entirely populated by happy lovers." It is this reflection of himself and the sculptors and the woman all in the mirrors that are what overwhelm him and with desire. The voyeuristic gaze that was offered by those mirrors is similarly deployed in libertine painting. Male voyeurs were often observing women from behind curtains, through windows while they slept, or in the case of Shaw's frivolous love, all of the above. Malet's The Meeting offers an example of this voyeuristic mirroring. While the watercolor could easily be read as genre painting of aristocratic life, again, the surplus of female figures bears multiple erotic associations. Above the three women, a small female nude evoking Broche's bather in reverse is positioned on a commode. Broche's statue notably shares its pose with the seated woman below. Both cross their right leg over their left while leaning their torsos forward. Malet hardly delineates the form of the statuette, sketching it out with a few well-placed lines. Rather, he prioritizes the flesh of the living woman, who is likely putting herself to rights after concluding an illicit encounter. Drawing up a stocking up her ankle, her bosom is suggestively pressed against her leg. Malet's strategic arrangement of figures guides the viewer's attention cyclically through the painting. Beginning with the impassioned embrace, the gaze shifts to the reflection in the mirror, to the Broche bather on the commode, downwards towards the seated woman, and back again to the embrace. Malet does not need to render the material specificity of marble due to its proximity to the animated, living female figures within the scene. In doing so, the bodies of the woman and the statue, flesh and marble, become conflated. Just as Tassert's Venus had been placed within a glass case to establish the boundaries between viewer and object, these paintings actually fared similarly. They were often held in private collections away from proper society, sometimes even kept behind curtains. The paintings themselves were not merely libertine images, but physical objects that could incite dangerous impulses. Writing in 1765 on the art of Pierre-Antoine Baudouin, the art critic Martin de la Cour expressed his disdain for the success of this entire genre of erotic paintings, and particularly the statues included within them. Quote, "The most lascivious statues and paintings are the most esteemed. In how many homes are these works the only objects ornamenting cabinets and galleries? It is true that they are only statues, but those who view them certainly are not." De la Cour's palpable anxiety regarding the erotic potential of these works, and notably the libidinous impulses of their viewers, returns us again to the myth of Pygmalion and Galatea. That De la Cour has to remind himself that the works of art are only statues speaks to how Galatea had infiltrated the psyche of the 18th century French art viewer. He is clearly not seeing only statues. The frequent quotation of these works in libertine paintings exemplifies this constant slippage between the female nude and the notional idea of a living, breathing woman. The experience of beholding such a sculpture engendered a sensory experience of both possession and pleasure that elided the boundaries between the inanimate and the animate body. Marble, surface, and skin became indistinguishable. In 18th century France, every statue could be a Galatea. Thank you. And I believe there's some time for questions.
Merci, Alicia. That was wonderful, wonderful. The marble to flesh, anatomy to art, stone to life. So many transitions going on there and all those rooms. That was really lovely. And do we have any question on the thread? You know that some people would like to say hello to all the people who are listening on Zoom to this talk. We invite them to put question on the chat line and we'll be able to relay them to our speaker today. But I can start with the room here. Oh, I do have my own questions. I always like to be polite. Madame, yes, madame. Just speak loudly.
Okay, I wondered how long this period of lascivious sculpture endured. I mean, you mentioned probably a 20-year period, but
Yeah.
is that the end of it?
That's a really good question, actually, because this anxiety around sculpture's erotic potential had in many ways always been present because of its three-dimensional possibilities. So we have records, for example, of Diderot actually complaining about a copy of a Greek statue at the Gardens of Versailles because it was known to be a place where people went to view it for not good reasons. So that's my delicate way of putting it. So we know that there's already this anxiety. However, it's this 30-year period that I've laid out for us is really when we see these small scale statuettes infiltrating very explicitly erotic scenes. And this does decline with the rise of neoclassicism at the end of the century. When we get Canova, he's really making sculptures that have this ethereal quality that then lose some of that small erotic tactile nature. He doesn't, I mean, his work is incredible, but he's doing something very different with stone. And so it really is this 30-year period for this particular genre. There is, though, in the late 19th century, a resurgence of popularity of these sculptures because of the Goncourt brothers, who immediately look at these and are like, yes, sex, let's go. That's the Goncourt brothers for you. Madame.
So my question is, were they frequently made, were the copies frequently made? And if so, what materials were they made of?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I only really have like 3 or 4 examples for you guys today because there were almost 4 prototypes, right? And then tons of copies. So Tasseel's Venus, for example, we know of at least 4. That's in marble alone. Falconet is reproducing his works in marble as well, but also in porcelain. So we do get just hundreds of these types of sculptures. And once you know to look for them, they're everywhere. I can go to any museum in the United States and Europe and find like 4. They're just everywhere. And that's what signaled to me that there's something going on here.
D'autres questions dans la salle en français ou en anglais? Il y a des choses. Madame Group.
I'm just curious, were these done by assistants or by the sculptor himself?
Yeah, probably by assistants. With the Frères Walsh, who I don't have up here, it's probably them because they're actually part of the Académie des Arts. They're not, they don't have a big studio compared to the others, but these are definitely assistants and also forgers. A lot of the works that come out of this style of work are attempting to present themselves as arguably more affordable copies. So we get lots of bad copies, which I know curators hate, but I love.
Oui, Madame Lorraine.
I have a question. I assume there were not female models. Were they young men who were modeling?
Oh, I would say actually that they probably were female models. I actually don't have records, for how they would have designed these women. A lot of it is this idea of emulation. So these sculptors have looked at antique models in particular and drawn them and copied them in clay and then in plaster and also marble, and then are adding their own twist based on the study of the nude model. And so in the Royal Academy, where we see Falconet, but notably not Tasser, or the Broche brothers, Falconet is certainly drawing after the nude male model at the Academy, but he's also studying, they are all studying the nude female model, but perhaps more in their studios and less in a more formal setting. But they're also studying antiquity, so these are not based off of real women.
If I may ask you, I was a little surprised by the sharpness of Diderot's answer to D'Alembert in the excerpt, where he doesn't seem to think much of the future of Falconet as a sculptor. Is there an origin to these remarks?
There is. So obviously, Diderot and Falconet, sort of their work here, their interactions are sort of replete through this talk. And Falconet wrote the entry for sculpture in Diderot's Encyclopédie. And so they had a very, very close friendship that completely falls apart in a very humorous, very 21st century feeling tale. Falconet leaves France in 1766 to go to the court of Catherine the Great in Russia to produce what he sees as his masterpiece, which is the Peter the Great equestrian statue. And they have a beautiful correspondence, Diderot and Falconet. They're like, I miss you, I miss you, I miss you already, you've only been gone an hour. It's very, very beautiful. And so Diderot goes to St. Petersburg to visit Falconet, and they have a huge falling out because Falconet, or Diderot accuses Falconet of not being as an attentive host as he should be. And so that's what we see, this transformation in his opinions of Pygmalion and Galatea, because in 1763, he's just admiring it in the most beautiful terms. And in 1780, he's taking a dig. He's like, it's still beautiful because it's Pygmalion and Galatea, but now we can destroy it and I'll eat it. So that was a very specific dig on his part.
All right, we might be able to take one more question before we close this program with Alicia, which was such a beautiful tour of beauty from a certain age, definitely pre-#MeToo. But we can indulge ourselves in that moment as we appreciate the art of that time. One last question, merci, madame.
So are you writing a book about this?
Yeah, so this is part of my larger project on Étienne-Maurice Falconet and his work in porcelain, which is why I gestured to that, these works, but also how these works were engaged with and in dialogue, particularly the porcelain with sugar sculpture. So that book is very forthcoming. It is, well, not very, it's coming, but don't ask me when.
Ms. Alicia, I will just remind everybody before we leave that the second symposium talk will be on May 17 with David Pullins from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, an associated curator of European paintings. And again, as Alicia mentioned, it's going to be about the sofa staging bodies in 18th century Paris. So I think that's going to be great to follow up with what we saw today. And we had an avant-goût. So merci again to Alicia. Let's give her a hand.
Merci.